So Benery and Frustuck, in their 2003 piece, The Celebration of Violence, a live fire demonstration carried out by Japan's contemporary military, discuss live fire exercises and the ramifications that these send both to populations within the state, uh, essentially citizens, as well as to other countries. And here, the image that you see to the right is actually a live fire exercise for North Korea. In the first weekend in September, Japan's self-defense forces organized a live fire exercise. Ben-Ari and Frustuck point out that this is a cultural performance more than anything else. And cultural performances are occasions in which a culture or society reflects and defines itself, dramatizes its collective myths and history, and presents itself with alternatives. And so they point out a number of aspects of these live fire exercises that are, in fact, crucial to this notion of cultural performance. The first of which is drills. And with these drills, you see as an observer the relative efficacy or the effectiveness of the military might of the state. Essentially, it is demonstrating not only its firepower, but also its ability to use that firepower in a very effective manner. And indeed, it becomes almost, as it is performative, it becomes almost a choreography of violence. And along with the assumed effectiveness that the message is being conveyed to the citizens, there are to non-citizens or to other states also potentially these are threatening actions. So both utilized for defense as well as potential offense or attack. They point to uniforms of enlisted military personnel, noting that these uniforms connote both danger as well as style and beauty. And in total, what the live fire exercises demonstrate is something that's visibly pleasing in this display of visual violence. Again, it becomes a performance, a choreography, and they refer, Ben-Ari and Frustuck refer to as violence as an object of fascination, enjoyment, and indeed celebration in these live fire exercises. Of course, we could also say that their observations might also apply to things like first-person shooters and video games and whatnot. This, as violence becomes an object of entertainment, of enjoyment and celebration, as well as fascination. Littman, in her piece, her 2005 piece on educational ethnography and the politics of globalization, war, and resistance, talks about public educations in the United States in particular, and notes that for the most part there's been an effort towards teaching towards the test with the idea of educational accountability, that teachers must be held accountable for what it is that they're teaching, that standards must be put into place, and that these standards are tied with specific knowledge and skills. And along with this comes an entire curriculum and the many critiques in the United States of teaching towards the test. Within this, within the focus on teaching to the test, Littman and others have pointed out that there's an undermining of critical thought overall. Further, community is eroded due to government actions where the government is able to define and defend what it is, in fact, that is in the public interest. And we'll see more of this in our discussion on terrorism, but we've also seen this earlier in the semester with the government attempting to define public interest in terms of in contemporary Greece, with squats essentially, or communes being essentially taken by the state for purposes of education and culture, building of schools or building of museums, or this is the alleged reason for this. And what this has also incurred is the idea of promoting suspicion and mistrust. And so we think about things like gates going into schools and things like metal detectors, and that everyone becomes potentially someone who is a suspect. And so you don't really know who to trust outside of the gate, and then assumedly within the gate you have a secure environment where you can focus potentially on education alone. Of course, along with this comes racial profiling that's been discussed extensively throughout the semester, but particularly in our discussions on crime and punishment. Littman notes that individual success or failure creates a circular culture of blame for low test scores. Often this goes back to notions of race. The Bell Curve by Murray and Herrenstein in the mid-1990s again tried to make race-based explanations for intelligence based on standardized achievement tests. We also see this more recently in Florida with calls for differential attainment levels in terms of education based on race. She notes some of the connections between education and the prison system as a whole, indeed in the architecture as well as the policing or the control of movements, both in and out, as being heavily regulated, where every individual is a potential suspect overall. There's some critique of public-private partnerships, including Chicago Renaissance 2010, where there's a very clear corporate and financial agenda that's associated with gentrification, supposedly bettering neighborhoods overall. And these have come through business as well as public-private partnerships, such as the Commercial Club of Chicago. And there also is a discussion about this idea of cleaning out a particular place and demonizing those that need to be misplaced. And we see this in Livingstone's piece from last lecture as well, discussing the preparation for the World Cup. In terms of militarization, there's emphasis on regulating youth of color, of disciplining them in particular ways, of regimenting youth in some sort of hierarchy. And we also see militarization in terms of public high schools and public military schools, both in the materials that are utilized as well as the individuals utilized to control movements, as well as the way that education is delivered overall. And so the story goes that this is a necessary thing that needs to happen, what some might lament as a necessary evil, that urban youth of color must be highly regimented in order, as a prerequisite for them being successful in any sort of intellectual endeavor. First, you have to discipline the individual so that they follow the rules for success overall. Sitha Low, former president of the American Anthropological Association, has talked about the idea of public spaces. She's writing quite a bit on Latin America and plazas. She makes her focus in the short 2006 article on privatization and surveillance and paranoia in New York City. And she notes the building of the what is now the One World Trade Center, what has been previously branded as the 1776 Freedom Tower, essentially as a public spectacle, as a way of recovering America, and indeed a celebration of America's resolve in the face of terrorism. But Sitha Low looks at this in the context of what the building actually means for individuals who live in the Battery Park and Lower Manhattan area, noting that the 1776 Freedom Tower presents an obvious mark on the skyline of Manhattan, and in particular a potential target for future terrorist attacks. At the same time, there were many who called into question the rebuilding of the World Trade Center following this particular design, as well as the fact that many of the office buildings in this region are not currently occupied. Low talks about the rebuilding of the World Trade Center as part and parcel of a movement towards privatization of the city as a whole and business improvement districts. She also notes that increasingly in New York City there are a multitude of ways to potentially surveil the general population. That raises interesting questions, I think, about things like freedom versus security in public spaces. Which brings us to, I think, to a larger question about some of the legislation which has really enabled what some would view as a transgression of our fundamental rights as U.S. citizens. And the USA Patriot Act, or which stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism, of 2001, it has drawn a fair amount of critique from both activists and scholars, including legal scholars, who challenge the constitutional nature of the act itself. Some of the things to consider with the USA Patriot Act is that it was brought together rather quickly. It moved through congressional scrutiny rather quickly, passed in both houses, and was signed into law. And one of the reasons that it was able to move through so quickly, some would suggest, is that it had been essentially cobbled together using past surveillance bills, which had previously been deemed unconstitutional. It was pushed through both houses of Congress to be signed into law by October of 2001. So it raises interesting questions about public hearings or debate. Again, it's really important to point out here that there was very little resistance to this in terms of both houses of Congress. It resembled portions of the 1996 Anti-Terrorism Act, which had been deemed unconstitutional by federal courts. And so some have pointed out that the USA Patriot Act has, in fact, been detrimental to freedom of individuals. Many of these same ideologies of freedom which have been espoused in the war on terror, that the United States stands for the protection of freedom. Amongst these are individuals that would cite to George Orwell's 1984, and in his description, his very vivid description of government surveillance overall, and how this imposes upon freedoms which would otherwise be expected if one were to read instruments such as the Constitution. This goes back to Locke's notion of the government being a contract between the citizens as well as the state, and that contract is enacted for the benefit of the population. And along with this, some freedoms would be protected while others might need to be sacrificed. And so the question becomes, in these legislative turns with the USA Patriot Act, have these gone too far in terms of government surveillance and curbing of freedoms guaranteed to U.S. citizens under the Bill of Rights? So in this lecture, I have hoped to have given you guys a sense of the extent of military and militarization in a variety of contexts. I also am hoping that you get a sense of military spending across the globe, particularly its large amount within the United States, almost more than the other top 15 countries combined. And I hope to have provided some ethnographic examples of militarization and how this has impacted populations in a variety of contexts.